BYRON collection, which brings together both textual artifacts and realia, material artifacts, in a way that is really wonderful to see and has been absolutely key to my understanding of Byron in my studies of him. And finally, it's great to be here marking the bicentenary of Byron's death. And with that in mind, I hope that my topic tonight is appropriate, because I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit tonight about Byron's understanding of monuments and memorials. And now I'm a little bit worried after those introductions that there's not enough stuff in this talk. But one of the things that Andy's right, this talk emerges in some ways from my 2017 book, What the Victorians Made of Romanticism. And one thing that critics said about that book was that it focused too much on material things and not enough on what Romantic writers said about their own reception. And so this is, in a way, an attempt to address that criticism, or possibly to show why I reject it. Throughout his life, Byron responded powerfully to monuments. As a schoolboy, he liked to sit on top of his favourite tomb in the churchyard of St Mary's at Harrow on the Hill. Bored during services, he stared at a monumental tablet on the church wall until he had memorised its inscription. These things suited his mood when he felt depressed with sad, foreboding gloom. He remembered the tomb and the tablet 17 years later, when he was giving instructions for his daughter Allegra to be buried in the same church. Tombs, graves, and memorials featured prominently in his travels, which constituted a kind of necro-tourism. And the places he visited often became meaningful to him because of those who had died there or been memorialised there. The thought that writers and warriors of the past had left their dust under his feet gave Byron a sense that his emotional responses to their sites of interment were profound and authentic. But he was also fascinated by the failure, inadequacy, or absence of monuments. Unmarked graves, unlocatable remains, and unsatisfactory inscriptions all intrigued him. In Childe Harold Canto 4, Byron turned from his impassioned lines on freedom, thy banner torn yet flying streams like a thunderstorm against the wind, to meditate in the next stanza on the tomb of Cecilia Metella. The speaker is struck by this stern round tower of other days, whose impressive appearance he compares to a fortress with battlements defending the treasure it contains. But he immediately draws attention to how little information the monument preserves about its subject. The poem falls into a flurry of questions with no answers, 10 question marks in the next 2 stanzas. The tomb tells the spectator nothing about whether Cecilia was beautiful or virtuous or faithful to her husband, nothing about the children she bore or how she died. Byron asks all of these as questions. Was she beautiful? Was she virtuous? Was she faithful? The tomb won't tell us. The speaker has to fill in the gaps by speculating in 2 stanzas beginning a chance on her life and death. Even the motives that raised her monument are unclear. It might reflect her husband's love or pride. As a historical record then, the monument is pretty much a failure. But despite this, or perhaps because of this, despite the uncertainties that gather round it, the speaker is moved by the tomb and feels a sense of profound, albeit obscure, connection with Cecilia. I know not why, but standing thus by thee, it seems as if I had thine inmate known, thou tomb. While the monument fails to commemorate any details of its subject's life, then, it succeeds in provoking the spectator to reflection. And these stanzas reflect, I think, some of Byron's enduring concerns with monuments and practices of commemoration. While monuments captured his attention, they also led him to reflect on their failures or limitations and their imperfect relationship to memory. He probed the possibly self-serving motives of those who raised monuments, but he also dwelt on the affective gravity of monuments, their ability to draw the spectator into reflection not only on the character of their subjects, but also, more generally, on morality, memory, and mortality. Byron, of course, was not alone in these thoughts. His contemporaries debated who deserved commemoration, how, and where. Napoleon attempted to regulate funerary monuments and inscriptions in France from 1804 and Italy from 1806 with the Edict of St. Cloud. In Britain, the Romantic period marked the start of a boom in public memorials that would last throughout the 19th century. Rapid urban development created new spaces for monuments, while Britain's wars ensured there was no shortage of individuals to commemorate who were suitably distinguished and recently deceased. Byron catalogued some of those who had streets named after them in the opening stanzas of Don Juan. Several other Romantic authors wrote about monuments, epitaphs, memorials. We might think of William Godwin's essay on sepulchres from 1809, William Wordsworth's essays upon epitaphs from 1810, both of which are talking about how graves should be marked. Ugo Foscolo's Dei Sepolcri from 1807 argued for the value of grave monuments and against their standardisation and regulation. Caspar David Friedrich produced a number of images of imaginary or real tombs and monuments commemorating heroes of the struggle against Napoleon in the German states. One example there. Percy Shelley and Horace Smith took turns writing sonnets about the shattered statue of Ozymandias, using that monument to think about the vanity of monuments and the transience of human achievements. 1818. John Keats and Leigh Hunt both imagined monuments to forbidden love. Keats in the Pot of Basil, which becomes a gruesome monument to Lorenzo in Isabella, 1820. Hunt in the shared grave of Paolo and Francesca, which becomes a place of pilgrimage for betrothed couples in the story of Rimini, 1816. You could continue to list examples, but perhaps that's enough to suggest that in these examples and others like them, Romantic period writers found monuments good to think with. Byron was no exception, but his approach perhaps was distinctive. Always willing to probe contemporary pieties, Byron returned repeatedly in his poetry to memorials, graves, and epitaphs. At first, he treated the subject with corrosive scepticism. He dwelt on the uncertainty or fragility of monuments in several poems exploring how they fell short of their intended purpose. Monuments often seem to Byron to be motivated by vanity, and so he repeatedly points to a gap between public memorials and private mourning, valuing the thoughts and feelings of individual mourners over the pomp of public commemoration, and suggesting that the two really have very little to do with one another. Monuments were supposed to represent a consensus, the consensus of the community about the merits of the individual memorialised. But many of Byron's poems featured outcast heroes who turned their backs on society. And he goes out of his way again and again to specify that these transgressive men, and some women, we'll come to that later, these transgressive men had no memorials and lay in unmarked graves. But he did also value the memorials of some individuals whom he admired, and this led him to think about what made an ideal memorial, or at least an acceptable one. Inscription on the monument of a Newfoundland dog, written when he was 20, is perhaps one of Byron's most famous poems about a memorial, and the only poem about a monument to appear in his lifetime. As Christine Kenyon-Jones notes in her reading of this poem, these lines are a parody of the form they seem to emulate, that of the epitaph. The poem spends less time praising the dead dog boatswain than it spends castigating conventions of commemoration. When some proud son of man returns to earth, unknown to glory, but upheld by birth, The sculptor's art exhausts the pomp of woe, and storied urns record who rest below. When all is done, upon the tomb is seen not what he was, but what he should have been. So Byron begins by imagining a showy monument, which is an expression of vanity rather than an accurate register of merit. Its sculpture exhausts the possibilities for grandiose displays of mourning and leaves the spectator feeling exhausted with its tiresome pomposity. The inscriptions of its storied urns, that's a phrase lifted from Gray's Elegy on a Country Churchyard, which this poem knowingly alludes to. The storied urns have a great deal to say about a man whose virtues could actually be told all too briefly. By pathetic contrast, the dog, unhonoured falls, unnoticed all his worth. The man's unmerited memorial is contrasted then with the dog's unmemorialised merit. And this opposition is then related to another, the opposition between public commemoration and private mourning. The man is publicly lamented, but privately unmissed, while the dog is privately grieved, but publicly unnoticed. The poem turns to address an imagined reader. Ye, who perchance behold this simple urn, pass on. It honours none you wish to mourn. So this is an inversion of the convention of memorial epitaphs that say, stop, traveller, pause by this grave. Byron says, pass on, there is no one here to interest you. Now, this is all rather ironic, given that the poem itself was destined to be incised on a very elaborate stone monument that you can see here in the picture. But Byron insists that this particular monument is a private act of mourning rather than a public act of commemoration. Byron returned to some of those ideas 8 years later in Churchill's Grave from 1816. And again here he opposes monuments and memory. According to the sexton in the poem, Charles Churchill's grave is visited by frequent travellers who turn to pilgrims and step from out their way to pay him honour. Although he initially claims not to know why the grave is visited, when he's angling for a tip towards the end of the poem, the sexton does recall that Churchill was a most famous writer in his day. Churchill's grave is unkempt and unremarkable, the humblest of all sepulchres, the poem says. It consists of neglected turf and quiet stone. So the poem measures the distance between the monument, which is inadequate and fallen into disrepair, and the poet's reputation, which, although also possibly in decline, is sustained among a select group of admirers. The poet's grave may be valued as a focal point for his memory, but his monument isn't what guarantees that he'll be remembered. It is, of course, his poetry that does that. So monuments have their own sort of distinctive temporality. They commemorate individuals or events from the past, sometimes the immediate past, but they also look ahead to the future. The time of commemoration is at once short and long. On one hand, it's tied to the immediate work of mourning. On the other, it stretches toward the distant horizon of future memory, the time yet to come when durable monuments of marble or bronze will call to mind the enduring achievements of the past. Monuments make assertions in the present about the value of someone from the past, the immediate past, and legitimate those assertions by suggesting that people in the future will concur, creating not only a present consensus about the merits of an individual, but also one that aspires to temporal extension. Right? We think this, they will think this. They predict that people in the future will continue to find value in what is commemorated, and they try and shape that future judgment. They offer the consoling thought that what we value in our present, they will value in their past. Byron was sceptical about this aspect of monuments, considering in several examples how they fail to produce the future they confidently predict. Monuments are supposed to endure, but Byron frequently drew attention to their transience. The heroes of Greece once had monuments, but the general doom hath swept the column from their tomb. Inscriptions could become illegible over time, Churchill's grave had a name no clearer than the names unknown which lay unread around it, while Hassan's in the Jowar can now be scarcely read. Or the inscriptions could be obscured as the result of a cataclysm, like the monuments on the floor of the church in the siege of Corinth, which become illegible with gore during the battle, and which then are destroyed in the explosion that ends the poem. Byron described epitaphs in the Vision of Judgment as lapidary scrawl. And this is, I think, a really interesting little phrase, lapidary scrawl, because it splices together two temporal scales. The durability of the word incised, of a word incised in stone, is spliced with the ephemerality of one scrawled in a note, suggesting that inscriptions too can be disposable. A lapidary scrawl, as though something incised on a stone can be just as disposable as a shopping list. Throughout Byron's writings, then, epitaphs do not serve their function of summing up an individual's achievements for the long term. Instead, they are often presented as fallible, fragile, and short-lived. When monuments did physically endure, time could still obscure their meaning. Sardanapalus dismissed the pyramids of Egypt because none know whether those proud piles before their monarch or their ox god Apis, so much for monuments that have forgotten their very record. That is a weird collocation, isn't it? Monuments that have forgotten, memorials can forget. Or monuments might fail in their purposes. Let not a monument give you or me hopes, since not a pinch of dust remains of Cheops. Byron asked rhetorically in Don Juan, where are the epitaphs our fathers read? He gave here the classical ubi sunt topos a distinctive twist by asking not about dead people, but about derelict monuments. Where are the monuments the epitaphs our fathers read? Death mows down the living, but this is followed by a second wave of oblivion, in which time devours their monuments. The very generations of the dead are swept away, and tomb inherits tomb. Monuments are designed to endure long after their subjects' physical remains have decayed, but Byron claims that the reverse is actually true. Dust long outlasts the storied stone, he writes in The Bride of Abydos. In the famous Words Are Things stanza of Don Juan, Canto 3, Byron not only said that words can outlive their author, but also that they outlast his tomb, to be read when his bones are dust, his grave a blank. So again and again, Byron makes this move of saying that first people die, and then their monuments fall into desuetude. Monuments last a little longer than lives, but they nonetheless are transient in an extended historical perspective. As Sardanapalus' curious phrase suggests, memorials can forget. For an individual to be remembered, therefore, depended on the actions and memories of others, rather than on a monument. While monuments fall into disrepair, memory is a renewable resource. Now this is of course an ancient idea, certainly not one original to Byron, extending back to Pericles' eulogy for the Athenian dead of the Peloponnesian War, whose memorial he imagined as graven not on stone, but in the hearts of men. In his early poem, Epitaph on a Friend, Byron deployed this idea conventionally. He laid claim to a grief too deep to trust the sculptor's art, and opposed the vanity of a monument to the sincerity of mourning. The eulogized friend had no tomb, no marble marks thy couch of lowly sleep, but his mourners were figured as themselves monuments. They were living statues, while the speaker had an epitaph recorded on my heart. So the people become the monument. As a mature poet, Byron returns to this idea in Childe Harold Canto 4 and Don Juan Canto 3. In both passages, he compared monuments of poets to those of princes, merchants, and soldiers, using Dante's tomb at Ravenna as an example. In the prophecy of Dante, he ventriloquized Dante, imagining how future thousands would crowd around his tomb, wasting homage or the sullen stone. This opposition between the lively interest of the pilgrims who visit the site and the deathly stoniness of the monument they find there is typical of Byron's representation of monuments. In Childe Harold, Byron regrets that there is no monument to Dante, or indeed to Petrarch or Boccaccio, in the church of Santa Croce in his native Florence. Santa Croce wants their mighty dust, yet for this want is more noted, he claims. The lack of memorial to Florence's poets is all the more galling, given the lavish memorials to the ruling Medici family in the church. But the absence of a monument to Dante actually seems like the most effective memorial he could have. What is her pyramid of precious stones? So this is the memorial to the Medicis, the pyramid. What is her pyramid of precious stones of porphyry, jasper, agate, and all hues of gem and marble to encrust the bones of merchant dukes? The momentary dews, which sparkling to the twilight stars infuse freshness in the green turf that wraps the dead, whose names are mausoleums of the muse, are gently pressed with far more reverent tread than ever paced the slab which paves a princely head. So despite the long list of precious stones on the Medici family mausoleum, the adjective sparkling is reserved for the transient dew on the grave of a poet, which is not described as being marked by any monument. Instead of a jewelled pyramid, the poet's name is his monument. Princes have lavish memorials, but even unmemorialised poets long outlive them in the esteem of their readers. Byron went back to think about Dante's tomb again in Don Juan, and there he contrasted it with the memorial to the early 16th century military prodigy Gaston de Foix, asserting that reverence here is paid to the bard's tomb and not the warrior's column. Byron noted how both monuments blend into the background of daily life. He claimed to canter by the spot each afternoon where de Foix is commemorated, and to pass each day where Dante's bones are laid. While Dante's modest little cupola, more neat than solemn in Byron's description, was kept in good repair by those who still revered his name, de Foix's more substantial broken pillar was treated with scorn. Neglect is hastening to destroy it, Byron wrote, and weeds and ordure rankle around the base. The locals apparently are using it as a latrine, which Byron took as a scatological expression of disrespect. He says, with human filth that column is defiled, as if the peasant's coarse contempt were vented to show his loathing of the spot he soiled. Just before we move off this noxious topic, we might compare Byron's epitaph on Castlereagh, which invokes a similar response. You may know it. Posterity will ne'er survey a nobler grave than this. Here lie the bones of Castlereagh. Stop, traveller. We're invited to interpolate the words and piss. In these stanzas, Byron dwells on the failure of monuments to coincide with memory, insisting that worthy individuals live on in the minds of their admirers without the aid of monuments, and that elaborate monuments cannot ensure that their subjects are remembered fondly or at all. So given that Byron was sceptical about the monuments he described, it's not surprising that he rarely imagined monuments for his characters. In fact, he tells us explicitly that almost every character of any significance who dies in his poetry has no monument, and often no grave marker at all. And Byron goes out of his way to say this again and again, beginning with Thyrza, who was buried without a stone to mark the spot. The heroes of his tales all lie in unmarked graves. The Giaour tells his name to his confessor, it's not revealed in the poem, only to ask him not to put that name on his grave. Instead, in a passage made conspicuous by its consecutive rhymes, he instructs him that his resting place should be marked only with a plain cross. Then lay me with the humblest dead, and save the cross above my head, be neither name nor emblem spread, by prying stranger to be read, or stay the pilgrims, passing pilgrims tread. The Giaour wished to remain as nameless in death as he had been in life, an outsider to the last. In the tales that followed, the absence of monuments became a recurrent motif. In the Corsair, Conrad's men raise not the recording stone to commemorate his deeds. Selim's corpse in The Bride of Abydos is swept out to sea, and the poem's narrator tells those who would o'er his relics weep to seek them where the surges sweep their burthen round Sigeum's steep. Lara is buried in a grave where priest nor blessed, nor marble decked the mound, and the narrator reinforces the point that Khaled, Lara, Ezelin are gone alike without their monumental stone. Hugo in Parisina dies with no tomb and is buried in unconsecrated clay. Alp in the Siege of Corinth is scattered in pieces by the explosion that ends the poem. For all these transgressive men, their outcast status outlasted their life, extending to how their graves were treated. The absence of a monument of any kind was a sign that they remained outsiders even in death. If monuments typically aim to express the consensus of a community about the achievements of their subjects, the Byronic hero's defiant individuality, his refusal to conform or belong, is indexed by the absence of any monument. Contemplating his end, Marino Faliero reflects that his total rejection of and by the Venetian aristocracy will deny him an epitaph. I have nothing left, not even a little love, or friendship, or esteem, no, not enough to extract an epitaph from ostentatious kinsmen. The steps from love to friendship to esteem descend to a blank epitaph that records for us Faliero's blacked out portrait in the Doge's palace, a kind of anti-memorial. Sardanapalus, mounting his funeral pyre, says, "Adieu, Assyria, now I owe thee nothing, not even a grave." For Byron's heroes then, the unmarked grave is a mark of obloquy that they claim as a badge of honour. While the discourse surrounding monuments was undoubtedly gendered, a similar logic held for Byron's female characters. Those women in his poems who transgressed gendered codes of behaviour often ended up with no monument or grave marker. Layla, whose adulterous love for the Giaour provides the animus for that tale, is drowned in a sack and has no grave but the sea. Khaled, Lara's cross-dressing page, is buried next to him in an unmarked grave. Astarte in Manfred is described in Act 2 as one without a tomb. Mira, preparing to immolate herself alongside Sardanapalus, momentarily regrets that no kind hand will gather the dust of both into one urn, but accepts her lover's judgment that in this blazing palace and its enormous walls of reeking ruin, we leave a nobler monument. Haidee, who loves Juan in defiance of her father, lies alongside Lambro, where nothing outward tells of human clay. Ye could not know where lies a thing so fair, no stone is there to show a grave. For Byron's heroines, as for his heroes, the path of defiance led to the unmarked grave. The only female characters in Byron's poems who have monuments are those who do not transgress norms of sex or gender. Caroline Franklin persuasively reads Medora in the Corsair as what she calls an oriental version of the angel in the house ideal, who is perhaps unhappy in her gendered role, but too passive to break out of its constraints. As such, she was almost the only heroine of Byron's poetry to receive a conventional fair monument constructed by the pirate band. Zuleika in The Bride of Abydos is another chaste heroine, the potentially transgressive nature of her unconsummated love for Selim being averted by the revelation that he is her cousin and not her brother. She is granted a monument, and a particularly interesting one because one that has a supernatural life of its own. There late was laid a marble stone, Eve saw it placed, the morrow gone. It was no mortal arm that bore that deep fixed pillar to the shore. For there, as Helle's legends tell, next morn 'twas found where Selim fell, lashed by the tumbling tide, whose wave denied his bones a holier grave. So Selim gets chucked in the sea, Zuleika gets a monument, but her monument continues to act after her death, continues to be faithful to Selim, wants to be with him, relocates itself magically down to the shore. As a pure heroine, Zuleika merited a monument, but Byron did not allow it to assimilate her to Jaffir's oppressive society. Instead, he made it act metonymically on her behalf to unite her in death with Selim. Preferring the turbulent seashore, where it is lashed by the tumbling tide, to the quiet gravesite, the monument becomes an image of Zuleika's faithfulness to Selim even beyond the grave. Both Medora and Zuleika remained faithful to death, posing no challenge to patriarchal codes despite their devotion to outsider heroes. As such, they both received conventional monuments. Similarly, Julia Alcimula appeared as an exemplary candidate for memorialisation in Childe Harold because she was a paragon of filial devotion who died after interceding for her father when he led an uprising against the Romans in what is now Switzerland. So, Byron was quite fascinated then by limit cases at both ends of the spectrum. People who were forgotten despite having extravagant memorials, and those who were remembered despite having no monument at all. And this explains, I think, why he admired Charles Wolfe's 1817 poem, The Burial of Sir John Moore after Corunna, when he came across it, probably in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine in 1822. According to Thomas Medwin, Byron called the poem little inferior to the best which the present prolific age has brought forth. Wolfe's elegy is spoken by one of the soldiers who buried Sir John Moore, who reports that we carved not a line, and we raised not a stone, but we left him alone with his glory. Medwin suspected that Byron had written the poem himself, and it does share several of his concerns about memorialisation. Moore is left without an epitaph or any kind of grave marker, but his glory is assured because of his men's esteem. Not a rebel hero, but a model soldier, Sir John Moore combines an anonymous burial in unmarked ground with a lasting memory of the hearts of his admirers. True mourners need no monuments to focus their grief, while true heroes need no memorials to be remembered. The speaker of the Thurza poems says, I will not ask where thou liest low, nor gaze upon the spot. To me there needs no stone to tell, 'tis nothing that I loved so well. So I'm going to pause for a moment and notice that the sort of pun there on 'tis nothing that I loved so well, right? Both saying that the thing that the object of my love is nothing. It is gone, it's dead. But also, my love counts for nothing. It is nothing that I love so, counts for nothing that I love so, but it has not done anything to preserve my beloved, except in memory. So the people who deserve monuments have no need of them, and so it can sometimes seem as though having monuments. So there's a curious logic here, right? The people who deserve monuments don't need them, so it can seem like having a monument is proof that you don't deserve one, while not having one is evidence that you do. The only worthwhile monument then is an impossible one. Sir Peter Parker was Byron's cousin. He was a naval hero who was buried with military honours in a public funeral and received a large marble memorial with a long inscription. So this is really interesting because this is a real problem for Byron. Right? Here's someone who he greatly admired, but who has nonetheless received all the pomp that Byron dismisses in memorials. So his commemoration, Peter Parker's commemoration, is utterly unlike that of Sir John Moore. But when Byron eulogised Peter Parker, he made their cases seem similar. Byron included Parker among a group he calls the brave, who don't need any kind of monument because they're remembered in the hearts of their countrymen. In vain their bones unburied lie, he claims, because all earth becomes their monument. The brave don't need a tomb because a tomb is theirs on every page, an epitaph on every tongue. So in order to square his elegy for Parker with his scepticism about monuments, Byron has to really kind of tie himself in knots in this poem to ignore Parker's actual monument and even gloss over the fact of his burial in order to claim that he would be admired and remembered even if he had none of those things. And Byron returns to this idea again in Don Juan Canto 5, where he made clear that he regarded monuments in general as a kind of vanity. Alas, man makes that great which makes him little. Huge houses fit ill and huge tombs worse mankind. Given this position, the only acceptable monument was a very modest one, like the simple urn mentioned in Byron's Ode for a Newfoundland Dog. Not the actual monument to a Newfoundland dog, which is far from simple, but the way the poem describes it. Petrarch's venerably simple tomb produced a feeling more accordant with his strain than if a pyramid formed his monumental fame. Julia Alpinula's tomb was simple and without a bust. Byron praised the small and simple pyramid erected for French commanders Marceau and Hoche at Coblentz. Simple monuments called for simple inscriptions. Byron particularly praised the simplicity of the inscription on the monument to Marceau and Hoche. And none could be simpler than the two epitaphs Byron found in the Certosa Cemetery at Ferrara in 1819. You know them well: Implora Parce and Implora Eterna Quieta. Byron felt that these 2 and 3 words comprise and compress all that can be said on the subject, and he wanted Implora Parce and nothing else for my epitaph. On several occasions, Byron imagined epitaphs that had shrunk to only their subject's name. When the brave are mourned in elegiac stanzas on the death of Peter Parker, I'm not quite ready for that yet, the voice of festal mirth grows hushed. Their name, the only sound. Their names italicise them. He criticised the inscription commemorating Marceau as rather too long and not required, and concluded that his name was enough. Similarly, he praised the inscription on Hoche's monument at Andernach as more simple and pleasing, translating it in full. It says, "The army of the Songquan Meurs to its commander-in-chief, Hoche." And Byron comments, "This is all, and is as it should be." In these examples, the name signalled the virtues of an individual who was sufficiently famous and admired to be already uppermost in the minds of those who read it. It didn't act as an aide-memoire because their memories needed no assistance, rather it was an external sign of the esteem in which the subject was already held. The enumeration of achievements that might be expected of an epitaph or monument was superfluous in these cases because it would simply have repeated what the spectator already knew. And if the spectator did not know the subject's accomplishments by heart, then the individual would not be worthy of a monument. Rather than trying to shape how a subject was remembered, therefore, the epitaphic name acted as a litmus test, revealing whether they were remembered, and therefore deserving of the monument they did not need, or not, and therefore undeserving of whatever monument they might have. The earliest example of this name as epitaph is a fragment, "When to their airy hall," written when Byron was 15. "When to their airy hall my father's voice shall call my spirit, joyful in their choice. When, poised upon the gale, my form shall ride, or dark in mist descend the mountain side, oh, may my shade behold no sculptured urns, to mark the spot where earth to earth returns, no lengthened scroll, no praise-encumbered stone, my epitaph shall be my name alone. If that, with honour, fail to crown my clay, oh, may no other fame my deeds repay. That, only that, shall single out the spot, by that remembered, or with that forgot." Here, in his first published volume, Byron launched his public life as a writer by imagining what it would be like to look back at that life from its end. As Marjorie Levinson puts it, the poem swerves from epitaph to prophecy. This proleptic epitaph makes a prediction about what Byron will achieve by imagining a future in which his achievements will be remembered. Now, we have to allow for a certain amount of adolescent posturing here, but nonetheless, Byron describes an attitude to monuments that would remain remarkably consistent throughout his works. He imagined his spirit not haunting a particular place, but diffused insubstantially in wind and mist. Detached from its earthly habitation, it disdains any kind of monument. It looks only for a name which should be sufficient to commemorate the person. A worthwhile life doesn't earn a monument, rather it produces a monument in the form of a notable name which can crown its owner. The idea of producing your own monument in the form of your name returned in Childish Recollections, just a few years later. And there, Byron mentioned the names carved into the wooden panelling of the fourth form room at Harrow School, where he carved his own name as a schoolboy. No splendid tablets grace her simple hall, but ruder records fill the dusky wall. There, deeply carved, behold each tyro's name. And he went on to imagine these as monuments. These graffiti were a kind of monument, and perhaps the only monuments that these individuals would receive. Perhaps their last memorial, these alone, denied in death a monumental stone, whilst to the gale in mournful cadence wave the sighing weeds that hide their nameless grave. You can see some of the ideas and tropes from that earlier poem, Went to their airy hall, return here. Now, given that Byron was writing about some of the most privileged young men in Georgian England, it was fanciful to suppose that they would rest in nameless graves. Doing so, however, allowed him to present them as the creators of their own monument, and a monument that took the form of a name alone. Like teenaged versions of the heroes Byron would go on to write about in his mature poetry, these boys carving their names into the walls of the schoolroom bypassed the conventions of memorialisation. Like Conrad, they needed no recording stone because they left a schoolboy's name to other times. The fourth form room at Harrow reappeared in a different guise as Jacopo Foscari's prison cell in the Two Foscari, where once again a name carved on a wall would become a man's only monument. Finding the names of previous inmates scratched into his cell wall, Foscari reflects that this stone page holds like an epitaph their history. He adds his own name. Bonnivard, in Sonnet on Chillon, also left his mark on his prison. His very steps have left a trace, worn as if thy cold pavement were a sod. Pacing his dungeon floor, Bonnivard creates his own monument that would appeal from tyranny to God. The trace he left in the stone offered a transformed version of the incised tombstone or monument which his brothers were denied. One of their unmarked graves is called Murder's Fitting Monument. These examples then offer self-made monuments that offer some redress to tyranny, allowing future spectators to honour the memories of their creators by turning Foscari and Bonnivard into the authors of their own minimal epitaphs. These self-made monuments and self-written epitaphs interested Byron because monuments and epitaphs represent the moment when the agency of an individual to shape their own destiny reaches at once its apotheosis and its exhaustion. On one hand, a monument can endorse and reflect a lifetime's achievements, presenting the summation of an individual's self-fashioning. On the other hand, being posthumous, a monument necessarily marks the end of those achievements and the moment when an individual survives only in what others think and say about them. Self-fashioning necessarily comes to an end. This contradiction explains Byron's ambivalence towards monuments, as well as his lasting fascination with individuals and characters who created their own monuments or wrote their own epitaphs. So, it's not surprising then that Byron responded powerfully to the monument he encountered in Switzerland to troops from Burgundy who died in the Battle of Morat in 1476. Their monument consisted simply of a pile of the soldiers' bones, bleached by time. They did not just create their own monument, they became it. As Byron described it in Childe Harold Canto 3, Burgundy bequeathed his tombless host, a bony heap through ages to remain, themselves their monument. Byron praised the battle as one fought with honour by patriots on both sides, but part of the attraction seems to lie in the unusual monument left by the losing army. Here, at last, was an example of a monument where the individuals commemorated exactly coincided with the form of their commemoration. By becoming their own monument, the Burgundian soldiers avoided the problems Byron had diagnosed in other monuments. Here was no ostentatious sculpture, no vain epitaph exaggerating the virtues of its subject. A steady stream of the soldiers' countrymen visited the monument, honouring and mourning their dead, and taking bones from the pile, all who passed that way removing a bone to their own country, Byron wrote in a note. There was no embarrassing divergence between the monument and the memory of its subject. On the contrary, the two were entwined. Byron couldn't resist some ironic comments on this in his note, where he points out that the Swiss took the bones for knife handles, a purpose for which the whiteness imbibed by the bleaching of years has rendered them in great request. But he was sufficiently moved by this monument to take his own souvenir. Of these relics, he wrote, I venture to bring away as much as may have made a quarter of a hero, for which the sole excuse is that if I had not, the next passer-by might have perverted them to worse uses than the careful preservation which I intend for them. In its own grisly way, this seemed the ideal monument. It was the product of its subjects' agency, it reflected the consensus of a nation, it was underwritten by the memory of a community, and its eventual disintegration would not be the result of that community forgetting, but of its work of mourning. And what about Allegra? Remembering the graveyard he haunted as a boy, Byron wanted his daughter buried at Harrow, where she might find in death the peace he had enjoyed when he used to sit for hours and hours there. He wanted a funeral service as private as is consistent with decency, and envisaged a simple marble tablet inscribed with her name and his, her date and place of death, and her age. He chose a quotation from the book of Samuel, adjusting the pronouns to fit the case. I shall go to her, but she shall not return to me. A simple memorial, placed on behalf of a single mourner and centred on a proper name, this planned epitaph reflected Byron's long-standing concern with what a monument should be. But as it turned out, his instructions were ignored. As the illegitimate daughter of a self-exiled nobleman, Allegra was buried, well, it's not entirely clear where Allegra was buried, but certainly she received no monument. Like so many of the characters and historical individuals who appeared in her father's poems, she was left without a stone to mark the spot. And perhaps, in its own way, that was fitting. Thank you very much.